The next technique I teach at the yellow belt level is escaping the blade. This is an introduction to knife defense. When I was coming up, we didn't really start focusing on knife defense or firearms defense until pretty late in our training. Well, really around the black belt level is when we started looking at these techniques. So what I wanted to do was introduce some simpler, more combative style knife and gun defenses at earlier levels to begin to build that into our training right from the beginning and smooth that skills progression. So when we get to the more complex kenpo defenses that we're going to do later on, we have a base that we can build off of. And this is one of the techniques that I use for that. Escaping the blade is a very simple defense. Many people, I'm sure, are familiar with it. The basic premise is we're going to close with our opponent, get him in that arm hold position, and then use the pressure on the arm either to damage the joints in the arm or to take our opponent to the ground. Real basically, we're going to escape back. I teach this off of a slashing attack initially, which is again a less dangerous version of a knife attack. Obviously thrusting attacks are far more dangerous than slashing attacks for a variety of reasons. They're harder to defend. Penetrating strikes are going to be far more lethal, far more dangerous to the victim. So we start with these slashing attacks, and really what we're doing here is a simplified version of a technique we're going to learn later, which is returning the storm. Real simply, the attacker's coming in and we're just practicing off these slashes. And again, at this level, with each of these techniques, we use that as an opportunity to train the attacks as well as the defenses. So the students are going to start doing some basic knife work, very basic stuff, basically 8 angles of attack, right? And then the ninth, which is the thrust. And really, this is just sort of an introduction to, what's a bladed weapon? What's a point weapon? How would someone use it? What are they trying to accomplish? At this level, we're going to do some very basic instruction in that. Now, again, as they progress, we're going to get more involved with the knife, both offensively and defensively. But this is sort of their intro to that, so that we can start to build that into their training and make it a regular part of what they're experiencing. So we're basing it off of this horizontal slash attack. One of the first things we're going to do is create space. Now, I know some people who teach some of these defenses as everything's advancing into the opponent, and we're going to cover that too. But one of the first things we want to do, because we're also talking about this concept of finding your entry points on your opponent, is we're going to start by escaping, which is why it's called escaping the blade. So as the student push drags back, they're going to turn their hands out. Okay, so usually in our self-defense stances, our fighting stances, we kind of have our arms out towards our opponent. Here we're going to turn those so that the backs of our arms are out. And this is something I want my students to learn, is this idea of shielding and choosing where they get cut. So we talked about it in an earlier video. This is my shield, right? This is all I've got if I'm unarmed. So I want to make sure that if I do take defensive wounds, I want to take those across the backs of my arms where they're going to be less damaging than cutting deep into the muscles and tendons and veins and arteries in the front of the arms and losing the capacity to, clench a fist or use my arms the way I want to in a self-defense situation. So as we escape, we're going to bring our hands up to protect, and again, we're going to talk about what am I protecting, my face, my throat, my torso, my internal organs. These are the things that I want to not get slashed or stabbed, right? And as our opponent comes through on that backswing, when he opens himself up to an entry on the outside of the arm, the student's just going to push in and they're going to get that outside arm hold position. Now, as I mentioned earlier, we drill this position a ton. I drill this with beginners all the time, and we drill it all the way through their training. Just recently, I was working with a group of black belts, and we were working this same basic inside and outside arm hold. I've worked this with Kali Eskrima guys. I've worked this with guys from a lot of different styles. I think this basic inside and outside arm hold is such an important part of your stand-up grappling. We're going to use this in some of our bear hug defenses. We're going to use this in weapon defenses, and understanding it and building into drills and building it off of a base at a young level in the student's training is going to put so many of the techniques they're going to learn later into a context where they're much more effective. So a lot of people, like I said, have seen this defense. We're out, we're in, we're controlling the arm, and all we're going to do at that point is we're going to use it against our body, which is another one of the lessons here that we're talking about, really getting in tight when we're stand-up grappling. I don't want the arm floating out here. I want it in tight against my body, and then just flexing that against the torso to drive the opponent down, damage the joint. It's a concept I call impact grappling, which is I'm not trying to go for a submission. I'm not trying to apply slow, steady pressure to a joint to manipulate my opponent. I get control of a joint, I immobilize a joint, and I explode into that technique to do as much damage as I can. I mean, we're in a street self-defense situation. A guy is trying to cut us with a knife, right? So we're not going to be nice about this, okay? So when we close, and again, we're going to drill this entering and exiting. We're going to drill moving out. We're going to drill switching from the inside to the outside, reversing the hands. As soon as we close, from that point forward, it's exploding in and down around that joint. Now, obviously, when you train this technique, you have to train it carefully because it's easy, especially when there's weapons in people's hands, things get amped up. It's easy to hurt your partner here. Now, the nice thing about that is it shows you, yeah, you get somebody in this position and you can really do some damage. When we're training, we don't want to hurt our partners. We want to make sure that they can keep coming to class. So you have to be careful as an instructor. You have to keep your eyes on the students and make sure that you're in control of the situation. So we escape, we close, and we flex into the arm. Again, we escape, we close, and we flex into the arm. Very simple technique, out and back. Very similar to what we're going to do later in our returning storm technique, right? Except here, once we get in and we get that arm in tight, we can turn with it if we need to. Later on, some of the weapons defenses we're going to practice taking that weapon to the ground, doing the step-on disarm. I don't really focus a lot on disarms. This is something I'm going to touch on in our next video with our gun defense at this level. We do some disarms with the beginners. We don't really focus on it much. We might talk about it a little bit. As we get more advanced, we'll talk about it a little bit more. We'll practice some of them. But really, the primary disarm that I want students to learn, especially when we're talking about self-defense, is knock the guy out. It's finishing, right? That's our disarm. Don't worry about trying to peel or defanging the snake or some of these complex disarms. Get control, finish your opponent. Then you can take the weapon away from him if you want, right? And dispose of it at your leisure. So from here, we're out. We're in on the arm as he comes back with the backswing, and then it's just pivot away and explode, right? Whether you break the elbow, whether you drive him to the ground, whether it's just a throw, we'll practice it in all those ways. We'll practice taking him down. We'll practice flexing against the joints to cause him to release the weapon. We'll practice it as the throw, right? Launch your opponent into a wall. Launch him down a flight of stairs. Launch him off the curb into traffic. The point is, he came at you with a weapon, and again, he gives you that extended arm. We're going to use it as a lever to manipulate his body. Our hands are up so that if we do get cut, we're getting cut out here. We enter, we control that arm, and again, we'll drill it inside and outside, but once we get that control, it's immediate, right? It's not messing around, it's not wrestling with a guy who's holding the weapon. As soon as we get control of the arm, boom, explode into the technique, impact grappling, right? So, like I said, this is introduction to knife defense, right? We're going to get more complex. We've got a bunch of kenpo techniques later on that are far more complicated than this. But this is just a basic technique for beginners to practice to start learning how to interact with that opponent, right? And really for me, and I keep hammering on this, the key to making these techniques work is drilling the sort of what I call the in-between techniques, right? The footwork, the scrambling, being able to get that control and get it quickly. Once you get in on that opponent, I don't have to fuss around trying to get the arm. I get that arm and I lock it down and I'm immediately exploding into my technique. That's what makes these techniques effective, okay? So when you're practicing this technique, again, defending, closing, pivoting with our explosive, control on the arm, you know, we can add it at the later levels, all those things, wrist control, shoulder control, elbow control. Here, I just want the students to isolate the arm and damage it, destroy it, right? And from there, if they need to, they can continue to control that guy all the way to the ground, nice and controlled, finish him with some sort of submission or hold at that point. If they need to release and pummel with strikes, that's fine too. We're going to drill it both ways, right? But what I want them to be able to do is to not get cut, and, you know, obviously you may get cut. We all know that when we talk about weapons defense. Everybody says, if you're defending against a knife, the first thing you need to understand is that you're going to get cut. Fine, we get it. But what I want them to be able to do is interact with their opponent, and hopefully through training, they're able to increase their chances of success, right? We don't want them every single time they come in to get cut across the neck. We want them to be able to understand how to get their arms in between themselves and the weapon, how to snake around that arm and get control of that arm, how to manipulate the opponent, and all those things come through the drilling, right? How not to get too far over their stance, but to stay over their stance and control the opponent's arm. So that's all part of this practice. Those are all discussions we're going to have with the students as they work with these techniques. Like I said, this is more of a combative style defense, right? It's not very complicated. There's not a lot going on. It's out in control and then just explode. Explode with a disarm, explode with a throw, explode with a takedown, destroy the opponent's limb. And then, that is a disarm at that point, right? He's not slashing at you anymore if you shatter his arm or smash him head first into a concrete floor. So that's how we want to approach these defenses. That's escaping the blade. That's the first knife defense, first kenpo knife defense that I teach. Of course, at this point, all the things they've learned, blocking, covering, escaping, those are all part of being successful at knife defense too. All the techniques they've learned up to this point, from the basic grab techniques to their striking and push defenses, all play a role. Everything builds on previous lessons to make the next technique more effective. So that's escaping the blade. If you have any questions, let me know.